Hi, I'm Ali Porti, fashion and lifestyle journalist and editor of Zayla magazine. I've always been interested in biographies and in the stories of people's lives, basically listening to what stirs their souls. Welcome to the soulful side of life, where I let you in on some of my conversations with inspiring people from around the world in fashion, faith, entertainment, music, and entrepreneurship. These are conversations that stir the soul about people's journeys, about the ups and downs of life, and how they have overcome certain situations. I hope that these episodes will inspire your life in some way, so enjoy over a cup of something hot or on your drive to work. This is The Soulful Side of Life and can be found on Spotify Podcasts or Apple Podcasts. So, welcome to another podcast episode of The Soulful Side of Life with Ali Porti, that's me. And today is podcast episode number 55 with Mary Marantz, who is the best-selling author of the books Dirt and Underestimated. And she has a very popular podcast called The Mary Marantz Show. She grew up in a trailer in rural West Virginia and was the first in her family to go to college before going on to Yale for law school. Her work has been featured on CNN, MSN, Business Insider, Bustle, Thrive Global, Southern Living, Hallmark Home and Family, and much more. She and her husband Justin live in an 1880s fixer-upper by the sea in New Haven, Connecticut, with their two very fluffy golden retrievers, Goodspeed and Atticus. In this episode, we talk about her book, Underestimated, and dive into topics around the book. Listen as Mary unpacks themes of what it means to be crippled by fear. But when we overcome, we are often underestimated by those around us. And you can learn more about Mary at her website, marymarantz.com. So enjoy this podcast episode. Thank you so much for joining the podcast, Mary. I appreciate it.
Oh, Ali, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, okay. So you've written a book titled Underestimated, and it really catches your attention, the first chapter. I'm curious, what was it that led you to write this book? Why did you feel that you needed to cover this topic?
The short answer, Ali, is my whole life. They always say write the book that you need. And, a little backstory for your listeners who maybe are meeting me for the first time. I grew up in a single wide trailer in very rural West Virginia. I was born in 1980. And so these were sort of like the tin can single wide trailers, not really built to last. And we lived in that trailer until I left for college at 18. Mm-hmm. And so at a certain point, a few years in, the roof starts leaking and it starts caving in. And I said the smell of mildew would cling to your clothes and your very dignity. And that, I think, shaped in me this idea very early on that I was an underdog and that I was always going to have to prove people wrong, that I was going to have to show them how far I've come, and that I'm an introvert, I'm the kind one, the quiet one, the one so often overlooked. So I'm not usually the first one people pick to go on and do big things, but that's just sort of, for a lot of my life, I used that as jet fuel. Let's go, I'll show you all then. And I think I have some of the receipts to back that up. I got into Yale for law school. My husband and I were photographers. We took that to the very top of our career. I signed a book deal for 5 books. So, I have these highlight reel kind of moments, and none of it ever made me stop feeling like the underdog. I always like to say there's no amount of more that can make you stop feeling less than. And so when I say I needed this book, what I really mean is I set out to write a book about when everybody in the world counts you out. And we definitely talk about that in this book. We do not skip over that part. But what shocked me is how it became, as I was writing, much more a book about the times we do that to ourselves. We don't ourselves. There's something in our story that tells us we can't handle more. And so every time we get close to that next breakthrough moment, we blink and the boulder rolls all the way back down the mountain. And so how do we undo that? That was sort of what I set out to write about.
Yeah, and I can really tell that thesis in the first chapter where you really are focusing, and I've only gotten to the first chapter, but focusing on the lies that we can tell ourselves to not get started on a thing. And fear can be very crippling. I think, as believers, the devil can use that to stop the plans that God has for our lives. But I think about the parable of the talents, and one of the guys buried his talent, and you pose the, in the first chapter, this idea of, which kind of person are you? Are you the person that starts and then stops because you run into things, or do you not even get started at all? And it made me think about the parable of the talent. And I think for those who allow fear to cripple them and they don't start whatever their calling is, Jesus called that person who buried the talent wicked and evil. And I think that there can be spiritual consequences for even allowing fear to cripple you. Or what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I love this question. Oh, Allie, we're going to be friends because I love deep, layered, let's just roll up. We just met, let's go. Let's roll up our sleeves and get into it. So a couple things came up for me when you were talking. I would actually really like to go dig into that scripture and see, what the words were, maybe even look at some root words. I wonder if, I would be curious to find out if the meaning of wicked and evil is more so the forces that are convincing you to do that, or giving into those forces, or just that the act itself is. I don't know that it would be that the, in light of grace, I don't know that it would be that the person themselves are lost to being wicked, in that way. I think it's more so that wickedness would love it if we stopped shining our light. But I'd be really interested to actually break apart those words and see what's there. Yeah. But more to the point of what you were talking about earlier of this idea of fear coming after all of us. And, as believers, we would call that an enemy of our soul. We would call that Satan. And one of my favorite parts in the book, this is actually in chapter 2, that kind of came to me. This was sort of one of those, as writers, these are the epiphany moments we wait for, where we connect dots we haven't quite seen connected before. And that is, it's 2 parts. One, I said, fear is not a very creative guy, but he is a busy guy, which means he's very good at prioritizing. So if people are playing small already, if they're already stuck in those cycles of all or nothing thinking that tell them everything, all the conditions have to be perfect before I can begin, then they're pretty much already set. A little all or nothing thinking sprinkled in and they're all set. But for the rest of us who, if the tension of going another year and not doing anything about this dream we can't stop thinking about is becoming so uncomfortable that this voice inside us is whispering, maybe it's time, we start to notice that maybe fear is attacking us. I say in the book, creatives. Maybe fear attacks creatives in particular because it itself is jealous, but it's not creative at all. Right? The force of fear, it uses the same boring scripts on all of us, the same ones it uses on you, Allie. I know it uses on me, and I bet everybody listening, let's just do a little test at home. It's all been done. It's all been done better. It's all been done by somebody the world actually cares about. I can't start until it's perfect. I can't start until I know every single step in the blueprint. What if I start and the critics come? What if they say, who does she think she is? What if I start and I can't stay consistent with it? What if I don't have the bandwidth? What if my voice doesn't really matter? What if I don't really matter? What if it's already too late? Right? Chances are, if you're listening at home, you could check the box on nearly every single one of those. And so fear is a very powerful force in our lives. It keeps way too many of us stuck for way too long. I wanted to write a book when I was 5, and my first book came out when I was 40. But as soon as you start to realize that it's a powerful force, but not a very original force, and that you can start to see these same boring scripts it uses over and over on all of us, it becomes a lot easier to say, oh, right, this is not me. This is not God. This is a boring script of fear. So now I know who I'm dealing with. And it's as soon as you acknowledge fear in the room and being I know who you are and I know what you're doing, It's not that it goes away. It just becomes a lot easier to put it in its place.
Yeah.
And we're going to move forward anyway. It's like Liz Gilbert has a quote about, you can be in the car, but you're not driving. You're not behind the driving wheel, the steering wheel.
I think it's really a turning point when you see fear for what it is. When I was living in Berlin, I was asked to give a speech on the 4th of July at an event, and I'm a shy person by nature, and I hate public speaking. But when I got the email, I said, no, I'm not doing it. And I felt like God tapped me on the shoulder and say, let's do this. And I decided to do it, and I got some training from a friend of a friend. And I had shared an experience in 11th grade where I almost fainted in front of the class because I had to do a presentation. And my friend's friend prayed for me. And the way she prayed, she said, Lord, when Allie is up there speaking, help her to see that she is speaking to you, and that the fear comes from the enemy. And she quoted that scripture in Timothy that God gives us not a spirit of fear, but power, love, and a sound mind. And I didn't realize that my fear of public speaking comes from the enemy, and it helped me see that it was an empowering turning moment, that I didn't need to be held or crippled by the kingdom of darkness. And that helped me be able to get up there. So every time I speak now in front of people, I imagine I'm speaking to God. I imagine I'm speaking in front of the throne of God, just having a conversation. And
I love that.
Yeah, the fear.
That's so good. That's so good. One of the things that jumped out to me when you were talking is another like descriptor of fear that I give in that second chapter is that you go ahead, drop a pin. If there were a GPS coordinate for where fear is going to attack you, it's at the crosshair intersection where your gifts meet your story. A good friend of mine named Kim Butler said this quote to me once. She said, our greatest points of impact will come from our deepest places of empathy. And that means that fear knows that it can't just attack the gifts you've been given. It's going to attack those. It's going to start there. If you have the gift of words, it's going to tell you that your voice doesn't really matter. If you have the gift of, prophecy, it's going to make you terrified to get up there and open your mouth, right? If you have the gift of being a visionary, seeing other people for who they are and who they are becoming, you will spend most of your life feeling overlooked, right? These things that you offer the world, you will feel like the world does not see you in them. And that could be enough right there, except fear understands that when there are places in our story that have broken our hearts for certain groups of people or certain topics or whatever the case is, for me, I have a huge heart for people who are breaking chains in their family tree. They are the generation changers, and they've come really far, but they keep hitting their heads up against this ceiling, dropping the boulder and it rolls back down the mountain because they've come a certain distance, but they feel like they can't go any further because they don't feel like they can be trusted with it. And they kind of just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again, blinking at the last minute over and over again. And so it's going to attack you at that place of your story as well. And it's going to tell you that whatever has happened in your story that brought you to this moment, that thing disqualifies you. When in fact, it's the thing that's going to make you get up and fight and write for 12 hours a day to put a book out into the world. I wrote for 12 hours a day for 12 months on Underestimated. That thing in your story is actually going to be the, superpower that keeps you waking up and fighting for it over and over again, because it stops being just about you. You know in your bones who you wake up every day and you serve. So it's going to attack you both.
Yeah. And you talk about in chapter 1 healing, and I think sometimes people have to go through healing, maybe to do that thing that they're called to do. Could be rejection, different kinds of wounds. 100%.
One of the things I hope people listening, if you don't take anything else out of this episode, I hope you take this, and that is that one of the other sections later in the book is titled this, but it's the same point that I'm making there in chapter 1. It's grief is a story not yet lived. Grief is the story you thought you would be living by now. And it's this mourning of the regret of how much further along you would be by now if you didn't have to stop and do all this healing first.
Mm-hmm.
And chapter 1, it's just a recognition that we don't all start at the same starting line in life. Some of us did not have to process our entire childhoods before we started showing up in the world, and then some of us do. And so it's this call to be patient with yourself, to understand that even though it feels like ropes or lead weights tied up around your ankles tripping you up right now, it's actually going to be the thing that gives you the fuel to run the marathon. Because like I said before, you're going to know what you're fighting for.
Yeah, for sure. How did you go from growing up in a single wide trailer, coming from one of the poorest states in the U.S., to Yale Law School?
God is the short answer.
Yeah.
But God. And I think, I was just having this conversation a couple days ago. I was out at a conference and got into a really deep conversation off in the corner with somebody, which is my favorite way to do a conference, by the way. And we were talking about this idea of, there is the part in any of our stories and any of the things we're going after, there's the part where we have to show up and we have to do the good work that's prepared for us in advance. We get the honor of co-creating with God. And that involves rolling up our sleeves alongside him. But the best things that have ever happened in my life, I do think me showing up and putting in the preparation, or, studying the craft, or honing the gifts that I've been given, I think that was an important element, but there's always this gap. So I had the grades and I had the scores to get into a good law school, but to get into the #1 law school, when everybody who was applying had those kinds of grades and those kinds of scores, if not better, in this really beautiful, ironic way, I think the thing that made me stand out in a sea of overachievers, of which I was one, an A++ kind of people, is that this thing I've been running from my entire life actually made it so that I had an opinion and a voice and a perspective that wasn't already represented in that class makeup. And that is growing up in a trailer in West Virginia. And so this thing I'm running from, this thing I think is going to disqualify me, this thing I think I have to hide from my entire life, actually starts to open really powerful door. And, in a similar, just really fun way, the trailer, like I said, smelled like mildew, and I thought that would follow me forever. When my husband, Justin, and I were searching to buy our first house in this incredible string of events that are just too unbelievable to be real, we actually end up being able, our first house is a house on the water in Connecticut, which that doesn't happen to anybody. But part of the reason is there had been a flood with a pipe on the 3rd floor. It was in foreclosure, nobody was watching, it rained for days before they caught it, and then it sat for months, and when we walked in, it smelled like mildew. And so here's the girl in the trailer who hated the smell of mildew, and mildew becomes the thing that opens the door to this dream of a house we now get to live in 15 years later, gutting it, it's nearly finished. So there's just some really cool parts in your story where you show up, you do what's being asked of you, you are obedient with where you're being called, but then you recognize that at a certain point you cannot force the outcome. That you, in my second book, Slow Growth, I say you can plant the seeds in the ground, but you cannot go and rip them open in the hopes of speeding up the process. There's this magic that happens in darkness. And I, as a recovering, child of the 80s, proud, stoic, Appalachian, somebody with, I'm an Enneagram 4, but I have a very strong wing 3. I'm really recovering with being okay with me not being the one who makes it all happen.
We have to learn to surrender things to God's hands.
Right.
You talk about in the book this concept of simple shifts, to stop playing small and move from stuck to start. What can you tell us about these kinds of shifts?
So I read this article once that said the best ideas are a switch, not a dial. They don't turn the volume up on what we were already thinking. They find a way to flip that thinking on its very head. And so, the subtitle to this book is The Surprisingly Simple Shift to Quit Playing Small, Name the Fear, put a name to it, and then move forward anyway. Surprisingly simple shift to quit playing small, name the fear, move forward anyway. And so often when we think, oh, you're playing small, you need to quit playing small, we think the solution to that is to go big, go super big with every single decision, right? Leap and the net will appear. And I've had plenty of moments like that in my life. I go to Yale Law School, $50,000 a year for 3 years, and I graduate only to become a wedding photographer with my husband, leap and the net will appear. And so there are moments for going big, 100%. And there have been some go big moments in my life. But the truth is, ironically, some of the best and most important work we will do to quit playing small is actually by starting small. I had Dr. Allison Cook on my podcast a few years back, and I was telling her about, this is chapter 3 in the book, I was telling her about seeing this post on social media on one of those like cheesy Lions and Lamborghinis kind of success accounts, it's like roar and get everything you came for or whatever. And this post was different than the stuff they normally posted because it was this little shot glass, and it said, if you think you have the capacity of a shot glass, every time you get a little bit more than that, you will subconsciously shrink yourself back down to fit into the tiny containers you believe you belong in. And so, that hit me so hard because it's just the clearest explanation of self-sabotage that I had ever seen. And, when I was just like trying to process, why do we keep starting over? Why do we keep not trusting ourselves? This idea is that as I was sitting with Dr. Allison Cook on the podcast and telling her this story, it related to a quote in her book that said, if you didn't grow up in safety or stability, you will feel an internal sense of chaos that you can't be trusted. And the way you start to break that is by setting small but important commitments to yourselves every day and actually keeping them. And every day you do that, you are showing yourself there is a grown-up in the room now who can be trusted. That grown-up is you. And so that becomes kind of the overarching shift in the book, is like, we're going to set these small but important shifts, small but important commitments, and we're going to expand our capacity to self-trust. So little t trust for Christians, it's capital T trust. Our ultimate trust is in God, but little t trust is like stewardship of what we're being trusted with. And so, yes, we're gonna expand that. We're gonna grow that like a muscle, and that doesn't happen in these overnight swings. It happens by what you do every single day. So that's just a real shift in mindset of, I'm far less interested in the like top 5 big goals you've hit, and I'm more interested in who you are in your day-to-day life. Every single day, who are you? Are you becoming a person who can be trusted with these goals?
Like a lot of the world's what we would call successful people, billionaires and entrepreneurs, I wonder if they, of course, it would mean going and looking at their stories, but I'm sure that they struggle with a lot of these same things, but there's something in them. I think a lot of them probably had fear, but there was this drive to just go for it. Or I don't know, maybe they have a different kind of brain structure. I don't know. But there's a lot of successful people, even actors who grew up poor, and actors, for every, what's the statistic? For every rejection, 99 rejections, you get one movie role or something like that. So I think that successful people struggle with these self-sabotaging mindsets and fear, but perhaps there's something in them that they just go for it.
Yeah, actually, so one of the things I talk about, I want to say this is in chapter 5, but to be determined. I want to say it's 5. But I talk about this book called The Triple Package that was actually written by 2 of the Yale law professors who were there when I was there. And it's identifying 3 unlikely traits that most commonly lead to people having these great success stories like this. And 2 of them, very paradoxically, are that they simultaneously feel very insecure, right? They maybe grew up poor and they feel like they've got a lot to prove. All that stuff I was describing earlier about, I'll show everybody how far I've come. But they, at the same time, they call it superiority, but I think that kind of gives the wrong impression. I think it's more like just this sense you've always had that you can't explain it, but you always feel like you were being called to more, that there was a calling over your life. You were being set apart. You were being taken somewhere. You knew that you weren't going to stay where you were, David in the fields or what have you. I don't know if David had that feeling at that time, but we know that about David's story, like there was more to come. And so those 2 things can kind of like, they seem like they wouldn't coexist, but they actually kind of like push and shove against one another of like, the way that I describe it is like who this book is for is the person who feels like they're being called up to more, and they simultaneously doubt that someone like you will ever get there because it's you.
Yeah.
And so those two things kind of push and pull and grate on one another, and it ends up giving this drive that's a willingness to delay instant gratification for long-term results. And they describe that as like the three things that really kind of combine in the most successful groups in the country and in the world.
I'm around a lot of Hollywood actors for the writing work that I do, and while a lot of them grew up poor and they faced a lot of rejection, I find their egos are quite high. And it's interesting because they were able to push through that fear, but I think there's a lot of wounds that haven't been healed. And then they become slightly narcissistic and doing the most ungodliest of things to other people. And I think you can have this fearlessness to go after your dream, but on the flip side, if you don't get healing, you can just become an unhealthy person.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that, because we actually just watched, as we're recording this, we just watched the Oscars last night.
Yeah.
And I used to love watching the Oscars because I'm a huge movie buff. And that part's still very much true. But now I watch the Oscars more for the people watching. I find it really fascinating. And I always say to my husband, whether it's the Golden Globes or the Oscars or whatever, I'm always shocked at how celebrities, if you watch them on the like red carpet interviews or you watch them kind of interacting in the background, they are some of the most insecure, socially awkward people I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
You know, like they can't put together a sentence. They can't sort of explain what drives them or whatever the case is. Or they just become really kind of like snarky with the interviewer, and not even necessarily in a, they're so full of themselves. Some of them are, but some of them it's just like they're bracing for a sting. They're bracing for an insult. So they're kind of just like really, really guarded. And I think that's just so, and you said that word ego, and what came to my mind was not arrogance. It was like, you know, in psychology terms, when somebody's just literally walking around operating solely out of ego, needing to matter, needing to count, needing to make it, needing to be seen. And we really start to lean into the significance of the impact we were put here to have when we can move beyond that ego and those wounds and that, like, you know, like walking around in the world like one sizzling synapse of a raw nerve ending. And we can actually move into that like more interior part of us, this calm part of us, this peaceful part of us that knows what we were put here to do and knows that it's going to get here right on time, and what is meant for us is meant for us. And I wrote in Slow Growth about having, you know, I feel like one of those nesting dolls where one is inside the other. And it's like, I know that in the most core of myself. The problem is that outer shell is the one that has access to the world.
Yeah.
And it's really easy to get pulled back into it.
For sure. For sure. You write about playing small, and I think women instinctively know what it means to play small. I'm curious, what is your definition of playing small?
I think playing small is anything where you are shrinking, hiding in plain sight, contorting because it's easier than being criticized, seeing if you can shrink yourself up just a little bit smaller, doing back bends until your back breaks so that nobody never, you know, dislikes you or is upset with you. Nobody never, I think that's writers. Don't do that, but you know what I mean. So that no one is ever upset with you. So that nobody ever sees the flaws in the facade. You hold people at arm's length. You don't go after things you don't already know that you will succeed at or that you will be good at. You don't want to risk looking like a beginner or falling on your face. It's anything where you know, gosh, every single day you wake up and you know the dream, this thing that just kind of keeps nudging you. Like you talked about when you were going to back away from speaking in Berlin, there was just this force that was like, tap, tap, nudge, nudge. And I feel that too, like a little bump in my spirit, bump, bump. And you know, anytime that you have that and you know you're being called to do it, but everything else in that ego and that wounded outside and that raw nerve ending says, tomorrow. And tomorrow becomes forever. You know, the clock is ticking and the world is worse for our absence. The world goes on to spin and the world is worse for our absence. So playing small to me is anything where you're more worried about what somebody will have to say about it than what if you go for it. It's, you know, when you're more worried about, gosh, will this be the best of these that ever existed, rather than asking yourself, will it help one person? You know, it's anything where you talk yourself out of agreement with what you were ultimately put here to do.
Like dumbing yourself down?
That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
And or giving in when other people ask you to.
Mm-hmm.
I've been treated my whole life like my intelligence was a liability. Allie, I've been told, water it down, water it down, water it down.
Mm-hmm.
Be more relatable, use more common language, whatever. And I just reached this point, man, your 40s are really good for that, where I'm just like, I just don't have the energy for that anymore.
Yeah.
And I viscerally feel time running, and I can't do it as anybody else but me anymore.
I think it's hard though, I think, as a woman, because I've heard women in the corporate world say that they get railroaded in meetings by male counterparts. Cher, who's 78 and has a 30-something-year-old boyfriend, she was saying men her age don't ask her out. And I was listening to a podcast that Bethany Frankel, did you remember Bethany Frankel from Real Housewives?
Yeah.
And she was asked, would she ever get married again? And she was like, yeah, I believe in marriage, but it's really hard, like, because of her success on TV and launching her beverage line, when she meets a guy her age who may not have that same level of success, she said they get really intimidated. So I don't think she's the kind of person who would dumb herself down, but she gets comments, from men like, oh, that's cute, like it's some project, dumbing down her success. And it can be really hard, I think, as women, for men not to feel intimidated by that, and then you feel like you need to dumb yourself down. What are your thoughts on how do you, as a woman of God, speak and carry yourself and use your skills, what God is giving you, but also feeling like maybe around men you have to not come off as too smart?
I mean, let me just first acknowledge that it's a very real feeling. And I think every woman listening has known that feeling of like you have to change, like feeling like you have to change your tone, or, that you don't want to come off with too many opinions. One of my absolute favorite parts of the book is in chapter 12. That is about the inner critic, but it also is about the outer critic as well. And I actually name my inner critic Dear John, and I go to great lengths to describe this character I have in my head of, Dear John wears khaki pants or jeans creased from the iron. His shirt is all crisscross colors, but nothing too bright or bold or colorful. It's all taupe and ecru and, whatever, cream, like all boring beige lines he wants me to stay in. And it talks about he's furious when I walk into a room and have any shred of self-confidence. He hates that I have opinions about my career and my self-worth. And so I really go to great pains to kind of describe this, like, boogeyman we have in our heads of, and I say boogeyman, that's not to say it's not real. There are lots of men who feel this way. Mm-hmm. There are lots of men who would be quite happy to steamroll all over women. And I also think that they're just steamrolling all over each other, but they play that game that way with each other. Like, that's just what they're used to, maybe. But my advice is, in the same way, and we for years taught creatives and photographers and entrepreneurs, and we would say to them this idea of positioning. I am blank because I am not blank. And in a world of Julia Roberts and My Best Friend's Wedding showing up and saying, pick me, choose me, love me, let me make you happy, we have to lean into having that just quiet confidence of Popeye, who said, I am what I am. And when you can kind of stand your ground and you can honor the way God wired you to be. God did not make a mistake when he gave me this intelligence. Mm-hmm. He did not make a mistake when he gave me words, triple heaping of words. He did not make a mistake when he's put me in these positions of leadership and made me a natural born leader. I was the president of my kindergarten class all the way up to high school, right? President of my class. And so I am unapologetic about how I've been wired and created. And when you do that, when you can show up in the world and not only know who you are, but own it, not only know who you are, but believe in your bones that the world needs more of that in it, the people who find you, the people who love you will love you all the more, and the people who don't are never going to get it in the first place. And I think that's the same way, whether it's men at work or men in a romantic relationship. I've been with my husband, we've been dating for 21 years. We will be married 18 years in October, and that man has never once asked me to play small. Mm-hmm. And so you stand in how you were created, you own who you are, and the right people will find you. And there are plenty of men out there who are not only not intimidated, they actually quite love the strength and the intelligence and the leadership that you will show up with.
That is true. 2 last questions. The Bible has quite a few examples of people who were underestimated. Who's your favorite Bible character who was underestimated and really soared?
Yeah, I mentioned David earlier, and I feel like such a terrible answer. I feel like let's just unpack this for a second, right? In some ways, David starts off really strong, right? Like shepherd boy taking down the giant, like let's go. One of my favorite things that people say about David is that because he practiced for so long in the hidden places on much smaller targets, hitting a giant with a slingshot was actually rather easy. And so those hits matter. I love that. And I've known that feeling of being out in the field and everybody's thinking, well, who would be the one to be picked to go on and do this? And they literally go through every possible person and forget that you would even be in the lineup. So I very much resonate with David on that part. Then, we start to get into like more of the second half of David's story, this, man after God's own heart. He's part of Jesus's lineage. And we see him mess up. We see that he starts to get the kind of success that his character can't support. And he wasn't in that hidden time. He was working on hitting targets. He was honing his gifts and his craft, but he wasn't necessarily working on the character part. And so I take that as a cautionary tale because I see so much of myself in David that if we are going to work in hidden times, let's not just work on getting good. Let's work on being good, right? Let's work on improving that character so that if we do get to these places in the palace or what have you, metaphorical palaces, that the character can withstand the positions we are elevated to. And then I also just really resonate with David when he's whining. The Psalms, why have you forsaken me? My Instagram engagement is terrible. So I resonate with David, but I also I learn from that. Because I don't want to ever be in that place where I am the reason I can't stay the places God wants to put me.
I never thought about it that way. His character maybe didn't get sharpened enough as learning how to hide and wait on God and Okay. Is there anything else that you want to say about your book?
Yeah, absolutely. For everybody who stuck with us this long, thanks so much for listening. And there are a couple things that I can tell you. Actually, I mentioned some of that, like twisting yourself up into knots, and we talked at different times about being, this performer who has to show other people how far you've come. I've actually created a quiz that is super fun. It only takes like a minute or two to take. And it's called the Achiever Quiz. You can find it at achieverquiz.com or marymarantz.com/quiz. And you take it, there's like 10 fun questions I ask you, and then the results. So the quiz is fun, but the results actually go deep, Allie. I feel like you would like it in particular because of the deep component. And so you can either be a performer who's always on your toes, showing other people how far you've come, a tightrope walker who could care less, who's clapping, but you need higher and higher, bigger and bigger dopamine hits to feel the same amount of good, the masquerader who hides in plain sight, the contortionist who twists themselves up because to contort is easier than to be criticized, or the illusionist in the distance who's waiting until they're perfect in order to get started. They think they have to be perfect before they can begin. So I would say check that out. That's achieverquiz.com. I go in really deep about here's why you are the way you are, how it keeps you stuck, and how we actually break out of that. And then you can check out the book itself. We have a website put up for it at namethefear.com or marymarantz.com/underestimated. And my name is marymarantz.com/underestimated or namethefear.com. And we actually have a free chapter. You can download and start reading the first chapter right away, what Allie was referencing, what she read. And then we will also have it set up where when you pre-order the book, you're going to get the first 3 chapters right away. So you can keep on reading 2 and 3 as you wait for the book to come out. And then we also have the audiobook as a free gift when it's available. So you're kind of getting 2 books for the price of 1 when you pre-order before the book comes out April 29th.
The first chapter really pulls you in. So
thank you.
I can't wait to dive into the rest of the chapters.
Yeah. And I'm at Mary Marantz on Instagram. If you listen to the episode and you like it, or you take the quiz and you find out you're Achiever type, come let me know on Instagram.
Yeah, I'm going to take that quiz.
I want to know.
Yeah,
I want to know. Let me know.
Well, thank you so much, Mary, for your time.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me. It's great to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I hope that you enjoyed this podcast episode and that you have found a soulful connection to the conversation. God bless you, and until the next episode, go bless somebody else.